Hi, my name is Sindhu Vee. I'm a stand-up comedian and an actor. My new special, Alphabet, is streaming now on my website, sindhuvee.com, so please do go and watch it. And right now, you are listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Yeah. My name is Abhay and I share conversations with talented and interesting individuals linked to the global Indian and South Asian community. It's informal and informative, adding insights to our evolving cultural expressions, where each person can proudly say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing."
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. I'm delighted. I'm thrilled. I'm really sort of, tickled that I'm joined this morning, at least my morning, your afternoon, by Sindhu Vee. Sindhu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the name of your podcast is so fun. Um, and I'm excited. I think by being on the podcast, I'm in great company. I mean, you've
Yeah.
interviewed some really I'm like, wow. So.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a fun ride. Like I said, I usually keep the informal part to me and the intelligent part to my guests. So we'll leave it at that. And I think it's okay to mention, but we just shared some common threads of celebrating Amitabh and getting off with lots of kya baate. So I'm really grateful for that. You're right. I have had other comedians and other artists on, and most of us who are fans and really appreciating your work are certainly seeing how you produce art and how you produce comedy and how you produce the acting when it comes on screen or on stage for all of us. But I'm so curious as a comedian how you yourself consume comedy and how is it all focused on watching comedy or performance, or are you constantly inspecting and analyzing comedy all around you, for that matter, and not just necessarily in a venue? How do you go about perhaps consuming this?
I never get asked that, so thank you. Such a good question. When I started stand up, because I had never seen live stand up when I started doing it,
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, what is this? I mean, after the first time I did it, I was like, what is this? I got to do it more. So at that time, I would just go to comedy and sit in the back and just watch because I had never done that before. I watched a lot of YouTube. I also I would say like a many Indian people. I bought every book on stand up and just read and just started
Yeah.
reading and saying,
Yes.
what is like the history, where does this go back to? Because I guess my parents really raised me like that. And I was doing a PhD once upon a time. So there was this habit of you can't really do something you don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And it's also part of, I think, being from a family and a culture where you ask your parents something really simple and your dad's like 5,000 years ago in Mahabharata. And you're like,
Right.
what?
Yeah.
Everything went back to something.
Yeah.
There was a source and you learned from the source and then you modified. So I literally brought that. So at that time, I would say I was consuming comedy like a massive weirdo, reading, watching, listening, and then also doing open mic nights and then staying on as late as I could, given that I had three young children at home who had to go to school the next day, had to be woken up and taken to school. So that's what I did then. Now, it takes a number of different forms. I think that, I go to gigs and I stay, especially if my friends are on, I love to watch them.
Yeah.
I don't go to watch comedy if I'm not at a gig because that's just mental. I mean, it's like, what? That's
Right.
just mental. And
Yeah.
in terms of what comes out, I become a little bit more careful about watching, say, specials that come out that are there's like Ali Wong is great and she's talking about divorce and marriage and I don't watch that because I'm so scared of bleed.
Yeah.
And if you ever ask me, do you think that was your idea or Ali Wong's? I'll always say it's probably Ali Wong's. Unless she's talking about a Danish husband and an Indian. But you know, the
Yeah.
intuition behind I think a lot of people who are married or divorced or have kids, we all come to the same things. And I don't so I'm a bit nervous about that. So I don't really watch those until I sort of have some free space where I know I'm not really writing anything or I think it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Um, and it's kind of annoying because a lot of my friends and contemporaries in comedy are now catching up and having babies. And I'm like, what? Yeah, but it's great because I have teens now, so I'm sort of just a bit ahead of everyone, like coming up with stuff. So there's that. So I guess I don't really watch that. I do watch other comics specials. I'm a big fan of Nate Bargatze. I'm a big fan of Leanne Morgan, and these are just in the United States. I watch them because I don't think there'll be bleed, and I just enjoy it so much. Um, I think when I watch comedic films, I become very analytical. But
Yeah.
I think that's because as a stand-up, I'm fundamentally a writer.
Hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, well, that wasn't very funny. Could have said it like this. And I try and focus on the acting
Yeah.
because I think I have so much to learn, but I never really can. I
You
think,
know, no,
yeah, I just think of timing and I think, oh, you could have waited 10 more seconds before you said that. It's
I
ridiculous.
I was just gonna say that like when you are even like in conversation with others or around your family or observing and has time and the experience in fact made you a better listener and an observer, and you can almost like curate your thoughts around the anatomy of a story or a joke because you're listening for it. I mean, I know that when someone says something, even far away conversation, something remotely medical, my ears perk up and
Of
I'm like, oh
course.
yeah, so in that way, are you constantly sort of thinking about that, or do you have to sort of turn on and turn off so that you can just sort of again stay sane?
No, I don't really. I don't, in some ways I've become worse because my kids will come and they'll be telling something they think is funny. And I'm like, Jesus, make it funny. It's so bad.
Right,
And I have
right.
to keep my mouth shut because they tell a story and it's kind of funny, but I know if they just rearranged it a bit, it would be hilarious.
Yeah.
And I don't, so I don't say anything. Sometimes I start looking like I'm getting distressed and then they give me a lot of shit about it. Sorry, can I
Grief. Yeah.
swear? Can I swear on
Yeah.
your podcast?
Totally.
They
Yep.
give me a lot of shit about it. They're like, "Oh, you think you're a stand-up," and so, and I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I am.
I am, and
Right.
I'm better at this." But I think that's terrible because I do think that the roots of my thinking I was funny have everything to do with my father's enormous patience in listening to my stories when I was young, and I had a supersonic stammer. So imagine the amount of time it took to get a story out of me and desperate desire to tell the story and absolutely no capacity to do it well. But he never lost patience. My
Yeah.
mother used to, sometimes at the dinner table, she would say, "Oh, it's taking too long. Write it on a paper." So I would have to
Yeah.
write because she just was like, "I can't stand there while you're just like, ga, 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 stop it."
Yeah.
She would,
Oh.
shed no patience. But my father used to always wait. And I think so.
Yeah.
I try not to be like the terrible, critical of, how are you telling this funny story person.
Mm.
Um, I don't really, when I'm listening to people, I'm listening.
Yeah.
What I find difficult is when some people say, "I'm going to tell you something, it's really funny, you should use it in stand up." And I always want to say to them, that's going to happen never. Never.
Right. Right.
What's going to happen is you're going to say something you don't expect, and I'm going to pick that up.
Yeah.
And I'm never going to say it's about you, but it's somehow going to show up in what I'm talking about because it's made me feel a certain way.
Yeah.
But I'm never
Yeah.
going to take a story when you last went to the supermarket, bro. It's never happening.
That's actually fascinating, right? Because, again, it comes back to like what tickles you and not necessarily what tickles them. And I think relating that in a way, and I love the idea that like both your father and mother have very different, approaches to this. One has slightly more patience. The other is, telling you stories about, comedy back 5,000 years ago in the Mahabharata, someone sitting underneath a banyan tree, that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
you
For
know,
sure.
um, your comedy is so much of your performance and your work speaks to those roots, right? And as an Indian woman, and yet you have such an incredibly global lens of experiences, whether that's British or Danish or time in the Philippines, and of course formative experiences in India as well. Does the tone or even the temperature of the performance or even the writing, does it change at all when there are fewer or less Indians or South Asians in your audience?
I never had a South Asian audience. When I started doing comedy in the UK, it was just whoever was at the club.
Yeah.
And there were a few comedians here that were South Asian comedians. And they were all talking about things that I thought were funny but had nothing to do with me. They were talking about race and religion, and I was like, oh, I'm talking about kids, you know? And I think so. I never perceived myself as a South Asian comic.
Mm.
And when I was doing my show on Radio 4, or when I was out in, I don't know, Red Roof at a
Yeah.
comedy gig, I honestly, it never came up.
Mm.
And then after COVID, I would go to gigs and half the room would be brown. And I'd be like, oh, I wonder who they're here to see. And the promoter would be like, you. I'm like, me. Because,
Surprise. Yeah.
well, because in COVID, I did a lot online
Yeah. Yeah.
because we all had to. I think that was more surprising to me than perhaps to anyone looking from the outside in,
Sure.
because I have a few things I say. Oh, you know, I have my mother's accent that always comes up because that's how I hear her in my head. I have, you know, the way that we parent versus my husband. Um, but that's about it. I'm also talking about my dog and my hair and like, you know, stuff that's not to do with India per se.
Mm.
So first, so the long answer to your question is, I've never changed my material because I never felt I had a specific audience. Over
Yeah.
time, especially when I went to the United States last year on tour, I was so sort of, it was, it was so overwhelming
Mm.
because even though my comedy is all in English and is very universal, I was getting the same warmth from the audiences that were coming out previously to see Amit Tandon or Zakir Khan or Abhishek Upamanyu, you know, in
Yeah.
comics from India. That made me feel so happy because I've never really been 100% comfortable with not living at home in India. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
always a shock to me that I didn't go back when I came here to study. But of course, then if you marry a Dane, it's like, what is the shock? They can't cope over there. So I get it. But you know, like in here, it's always been something like a mystery. So,
Yeah.
so then my material changes only in one way, is if I feel there's enough quorum in the room, I will switch language real quick
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
will speak in Hindi and I'll translate it for whoever doesn't speak Hindi, but then it's got to be funny.
Right.
But it often is, you know, because Hindi, when you use it in a colloquial way, is hilarious. And I think in Hindi, I mean, I
Mm.
also think in English, but I grew up in UP in quite a traditional school. And I learned, you know, I did Navbharti. I speak what is called Shuddh Hindi, even though I
Yeah.
grew up in Lucknow. So I speak Urdu as well. And my mother was from UP. So yeah, so I will switch into the language, but I don't
Sure.
change the material really. And I
Yeah.
mean, if I'm going to say something about Brexit, which I did while it was still very like a hot topic,
Yeah.
and I feel that I guess I wouldn't go to India and start yabbing on about Brexit, but my Brexit jokes were actually about my marriage
Mm.
and about exits from marriage and Brexit. It was a complicated structure. So that
Yeah.
you can tell in India.
Right.
And also, Indians who are coming to comedy clubs in the big cities, they're as global as anyone else. They get
Right.
Brexit.
Right. Right.
You know,
Yeah. You're mirroring that for the most part.
I mean, I was in New York at a comedy club near Times Square, and I brought up the fact that my husband, and it was like tourists, American tourists, of the middle of the week, they had a harder time being like, wait, her husband is from Denmark?
Yeah.
Is he Dutch? They
Right.
couldn't wrap their head around it. Whereas in India, in any comedy club in Gurgaon, you can be like, yeah, my husband's from Denmark and Brexit, and they're like, yeah. So,
We get it.
you know, no shade on America, but Indians are very much more outward looking while also being very inward looking, of course.
I think that that comes across in the sense that, like you said, you can sort of, perhaps maybe be a little bit more of your authentic self as the language comes out, and of course the relating to that, because Indians are so sort of, the diaspora is definitely so globally positioned.
It
At
is,
its
it is.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, it
Um,
is. And I feel like the diaspora and I feel like I'm just like them.
yeah, yeah,
And in the ways in which I'm not, I just have to explain. And they've got a cousin or an uncle or an aunt, and they're like, oh, okay, fine, we get it.
right, right.
It's not a leap.
That's not a leap. And I thought, so I enjoyed Alphabet so much, I really, really appreciated it. And as it was just released, you mentioned in it how you never felt quite integrated wherever you've lived. And um, I took that as, kind of one of your amber topics, a little bit maybe. And I do you think that that sort of factual awareness of like knowing that like, hey, I have not necessarily always integrated. I wonder if that actually serves as an accelerator to truly integrate your story, and work as someone who's truly endearing and enduring as an artist, right? The fact that, hey, you've stayed who you are and you've perhaps had more challenges, that you self admit that, like, look, I haven't necessarily made the attempts, nor do I haven't integrated. And I actually wonder if that actually integrates for others your story into their lives, and therefore makes you that much more endearing and enduring.
Perhaps. I hope so. I mean, I've never thought about it in those terms. I think when I said that in alphabet, I said it because you have to have the joke. So I said that statement. But if we dig deeper, my father was a Tamilian. My mother was from UP. They married in 1961 when that didn't happen,
Yeah.
and it was completely and it wasn't a runaway elopement love marriage. It was semi-arranged from my mom's brother's side, but my dad, he fought with his family to marry my mother. She went down south. No one in her family had ever been to Bombay, let alone Tamil Nadu. Very different in terms of their world outlooks, very similar in terms of values, their, you know, faith in God and spiritual stuff and family, but very different. And it was always, my sister and I, she was much older than me, my sister, but I, from a very young age, understood that I didn't belong. I didn't belong on my mother's side. I was too dark. And I was a Venkatanarayanan. And on my dad's side, oh, they didn't like my mom. Tamilian Brahmins are very clannish. And I love my Tamilian side deeply. But for them, my mother may as well have been an untouchable.
Danish. Yeah.
An untouchable.
Yeah.
Danish would have been neutral.
Okay.
But she was a Brahmin, but they were like, you're not a Tamilian Brahmin. For us, you're just, and
You're out.
we were treated very differently by my grandparents, not in my father's presence, but and I think from a very young age, it was like, okay, I don't belong. And then to make it even more exciting, my parents moved to the Philippines. No one spoke Hindi to me. So I literally was like this Western little kid that would be brought to India once a year. So I think what happened is I held on to a sensibility that I actually, because of your question, I think I'm still holding on to. It was very much, who am I? It's not what am I made of? Who else am I like? It was just, who am I?
Yeah.
And that better be something real good when you walk into a room, because otherwise you're not like anyone else and immediately you're an outsider. And then I became 5'10" and it came back to India and everyone was like, what is this giant? I had so many points in my life, and I honestly don't know from a karmic point of view what I did in my last life to have this happen now. But at every point, I would turn a corner and be like, oh, I have to know who I am. And for me, that was always humor, comedy.
Yeah.
Can I make you laugh?
Right.
And you become exactly like everyone else when you're all laughing.
Yeah.
You just do. We're on the same page. I say something funny, you see me, we land on the same page. From a human point of view, it's very connecting.
Yeah.
And it's
For
very
sure.
abiding. And then it doesn't matter if you look like me or I look like you, or whether we're the same religion or I speak your language. Do you know? And I think it was that thing which has stayed with me. And now I don't want to be integrated because because to be part of any one group so completely, it just feels odd to me.
Yeah.
And also most groups have things I don't agree with.
Right.
So
And
then
it sort of makes it easy for you to, like you said, sort of constantly ask that question of who you are and present that and allow for that naturally then to be the connector.
yes, and it's a great editing tool.
Right.
You
Right.
see, because when I show up, I say, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. And especially like, for example, when I was in the arranged marriage circuit,
Yeah.
which my mother really wanted, and she started early because she thought she was like, you're very stupid. You're not going to have a good job. We'll get you married and all that stuff. I was so clear I used to have 1 or 2 meetings with the boys alone, and I would immediately state without my parents' knowledge that like this. And I did not seem like someone they would marry because they were like, what?
Yeah.
Because on the outside, I had all the right credentials, but then I'd be like, by the way, I smoke cigarettes. And if you tell my mom, I'll say you're lying. And they were like, what? And also I do puja,
Mm-hmm.
morning, noon, and night. And
Yeah.
I want to live in an ashram. And they were like, who the fuck are you? And
Right.
so that was one way of editing,
Yeah.
and it also made it easier. It's made it easier my whole life to opt out of situations where people are like, you're not like us, we don't like you. I'm like, okay, cool.
Right. Peace.
Peace.
I find that actually so fascinating and more than anything else, just very, very warm and endearing because again, we all pick and choose the things that we want out of that. And like you said, it sort of gives you agency to edit. I actually found it's funny when I saw Alphabet and I, sort of processed it a little bit. To me, it resonated almost like a very tender and sweet message, almost like a love letter, particularly to the people who mean so much to you.
It
And
is a
then maybe
love
that's
letter.
just right. That's just more of my take. Was that kind of by intention? Because that can be tough in comedy where you're telling a joke and you might be even relating a story, but someone often is on the winning or the losing side of that. And I just wonder
Yeah.
if presenting this was something that was, very, very intentional to make it feel that way as sort of like a love letter.
Yes. I mean, uh, huge, huge kudos to you to have picked that up. It is very much a love letter. It wasn't intended as it went as such when I was touring it, but I've changed it some for the filming. It's a love letter, and you can see in the credits. It's a homage to my parents and my sister. The three of them, I'm the youngest. The three of them passed away in very quick succession quite recently.
Mm.
And I was not prepared for that. No one was prepared for that, and it wasn't COVID. So I there's a story in there about my sister being in the United States in I would say not the most comfortable circumstances.
Yes.
And I remember and it was a hilarious story because it really brought her and I together because of our name. But when I thought of telling it, I checked with my mother. I called her and I said, Mommy, I want to tell this story about Akka. And she said, Oh, it's a very bad story for our family. I'm like, I know, right? Because in the Desi community, you start saying that stuff, it's wild,
Oh
And I
yeah.
said, yeah, but I think it's honest. And like, we all got over it. And like, she had to do what she had to do. And my mother said, well, and I was very scared of my sister. And I said, what do you think Akka's going to do to me? And she said, well, she hates you anyway, so it doesn't matter. Just tell it. But
Right.
then she said, but don't let your father hear. It'll break his heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I toured it in the UK knowing that nobody was going to mention it to my parents. And then as I got older, I thought, oh, I'm going to do it somewhere and tell Akka, and then she's going to fight with me and we're going to have it out. Because I did not, at some level, I idolized my sister so much that I thought it was wrong of my father, especially, but both my parents at some point to have felt such shame around
Mm.
whatever reasons that she landed where she landed.
Sure.
But I was the youngest. Like, no one gave a shit what I thought. So I thought, I'm going to tell this story. She's going to get mad. And then I'm going to be like, but it's fine.
Yeah.
And I had become an adult. And even though no one in my family really ever treated me like an adult, because in India, no one does when you're the youngest. And when your parents are alive, you're still their child. And my sister, I think, carried this enormous burden of both being the elder one and having disappointed her
Mm.
parents in ways that I hadn't. I thought me and her will work it out. And the thing is, I didn't get that chance because they all passed away.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to tell the story and then not have her be able to respond. So I rewrote it in a way that I think only makes her seem cool. So only that bit, I initially wrote it to piss her off so I could have a fight with her. But that was not the plan of God, I suppose, karmic plan.
Yeah.
So I told it because I thought everything I say about my parents and my sister, even implicitly, it is the roots of who I am as a comic.
Yeah.
And the day my father passed away, he was the last in the three of them to pass. I thought, oh, everything else I write from here on, I'm sort of on my own.
Right.
And I had to mark what they had given me.
Mm.
And so I very much thought about alphabet in that way, both in terms of the rewriting, but also the visuals. I wanted to look like a gift. Lots of gold wrapping and lots of very luxurious fabric and those greens and golds. And yeah, I mean, that was for me.
Yeah.
I haven't really talked about all of this and sort of, it's not part of the press pack around alphabet,
Yeah.
but it was. And I had to give that show. And that's also why I decided to self-release.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I thought this is really not about a huge special that is going to be, a star on my CV, which I hope it turns out to be, but it was never about that. It was, I feel like I ran out of time and I didn't know I was going to.
Mm. It felt like a lot of not just open laps, but a real open heart. And so, I mean, that you narrating this entire piece just complements that, so much. Your last few months of 24 and now into 25 saw you doing a
Yeah.
fair amount of acting and really
Yeah.
some terrific things that have come out. And a lot of that now, at least hearing this entire story and particularly about your family's passing in a way certainly connects the dots, at least for me, a little bit. I'm curious how much of that experience, all the things that have informed you so much and really been a part of your comedy, how much of that has actually bled into some of the acting? I mean, you've had
Oh,
some roles with Pradeeps and Picture This and the idea of motherhood and really that Indian experience, whether that's in the UK or in America. I'm wondering how much of either the experience has informed the acting, and for that matter, how much has the acting actually made you a better or a different stand-up artist?
um, well, the first thing is I flew off to do Pradeep's a few months after my dad passed away, and
Mm.
I had just was wrapping. I mean, my sister had just passed away, and then a sort of a year plus before my sister, my mother had passed. So it was like hitting me. Like I was like, "What is happening?" And
Yeah.
it was like, "Oh," everyone was like, "Oh, you're grieving." I'm like, "I guess that's what I'm just doing now from now on."
Right.
And I couldn't catch my breath. And also, I became responsible for a lot of the admin around the family, with my
Yeah.
dad and my sister. And I was like, and I said to you before we started, I'm very lazy. And I've managed to like,
Which I find hard to believe, but okay. I
but I
mean,
mean, I'm very lazy. Like, it takes a lot for me to like get up and do admin. And then all of a sudden, I found myself, it's one thing to mess with your admin, but you can't disrespect your father's admin and
right.
your sister's. So
Yeah.
I was like, holy crap. Um, so I was doing those things and I went off to do Pradeep's. And in Pradeep's, I remember in particular having to really, there were scenes I have with Sahana Srinivasan. She's my daughter in that show, Bhanu,
Mm.
where the mother and the daughter are fighting and she's a teen. And when we moved to the Philippines, my sister was a teenager. And my parents were very tough on her, very, because they were first time living abroad,
Sure.
very tambram.
Yeah.
My mother was very conservative about what girls should and shouldn't say and do and so on. And they changed over time, but and so I remember there's a few scenes where I have to be quite tough on Bhanu. And I had to remind myself because it would remind me of conversations I had observed between my sister and my mother back when I wasn't aware that that might have been the roots of some of her rebellion, which then took her into areas that my parents forever, were so, they beat themselves up about.
Mm.
you know.
Sure.
So I had to be careful. I was like, uh, don't let your mind go there,
Right.
because nothing terrible is going to happen in this show. You know the script. I mean, I don't know what happens at the end because there's a big cliffhanger, and I guess we'll
Yeah.
never find out. But so so I remember that, but I didn't know it because I'm not a trained actor in any way. I didn't know that stuff could come up.
Mm.
I didn't put any of the dots. So I would do the scene and then I would go back to the flat and cry and be like, "What?" And then I started saying, "Oh, this reminded you of this, and so
Of
don't do that."
course.
So a lot of self teaching, I suppose,
Yeah.
to like keep your act together. And then in Picture This, I have a scene or two, special with Simone, where where I, where we connect. I see her, she sees me, and it's very much in the present. And that requires a certain humility as an Indian parent and a willingness.
Mm.
One thing I have not found Indian parents, and you're probably the exception, to say to their kids is, "I trust you, you know what you're doing." Oh my God, Indian parents are like, "Trust me, I know what you're doing."
Right. Right.
You know what I
We're
mean?
not the best at that. Yeah.
No, we're not. And there's good reasons for why, but there's also has to be some balance because we're not raising kids in 1965 anymore, right?
Yeah.
So there's a
Yeah.
couple of scenes, and we did those very quickly. Simone is a very accomplished actress, and I was able to do it quickly because I think in my eyes you could see that I'm I have some incredible parts of me that are from my parents as a parent, but there's parts of me I've learned not to do because of
Mhm.
my parents, and I thank them for that as well. And I think that helped because
Yeah.
those takes were so quick and so warm. And I don't think again I consciously thought of it, but I remember recognizing the moment. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah. Totally.
And so just being able to not think about it, just because I think all good acting, as far as I can tell, is when you're not thinking about it. You're just
Right.
in that moment. Um,
Yeah.
if I mean, not if I mean, I have no acting in the pipeline at the moment, and who knows if I'll ever act again. I always say, well, I guess that's it, never acting again, and then you
Right.
do something else.
That's the punctuation mark.
Yeah, because the thing with stand up is I have a lot of control. I can get up from this podcast and go and do a gig. But
Right.
in
Right.
acting, you're just like, hello, is someone phoning me? What's happening?
Yeah.
So as a stand-up, I'm always a little bit wary of this business of acting where it's like, who knows if it'll ever happen again. But I have now learned to think about it and then to maybe harness that as opposed to just be shocked. Be
Right.
like, wait, oh my God, like that has to stop. It's ridiculous.
I'm so just fascinated by this different way that people take their own personal stories and their baggage and they carry that to work, whether that's, in how they actually have those aha moments of saying like, ah, this is exactly what this means for me. And you're not even conscious of it, like you mentioned. And that sort of makes to having a little bit more magic, I guess, on the screen. But, it's such a different vibe when you're out there doing stand up. And one of the lines from Alphabet that really caught me particularly was this idea where you said you can't be sad and crazy without funny. And I love that sort of trifecta. And you're talking about
Yeah.
friendship and is that sort of and in thinking about like those instances on the two sets when you're filming, and then of course all the informative experiences with your family, is that idea of you can't be sad and crazy without funny, is that basically a proxy for you and sort of almost like a mission statement for you to sort of get through all the ups and downs of life, but in your very, kind of, you have a window for lots and lots of audience members into that. Does that serve as kind of a guide wire in a way?
I think so. I mean, I think you're right. It's kind of my brand.
Yeah.
If I had a tagline, it would be, you can't be sad and crazy without funny.
Right.
And the implicit thing is, I am sad and crazy. Who isn't
Yeah.
sad and crazy at some point? I think from my parents, what I observed, especially in my mother, is that in order to move forward in life, we have to not be looking for things to be good and happy. We have to look for things to have meaning. And that's really how I live my life. I don't think it was on purpose. I think I just was raised by these two people who did that. And so you have to have meaning. And the thing is, meaning in life is something, who knows what the meaning of life is, but when bad things happen, or sad, or shocking, or upsetting, you need to find a way through. And for me, that's laughter.
Yeah.
Because then it just doesn't feel that deadly, you know?
Yeah.
You're like, eh. And my mother's family is very much like this. Like the worst things happen. And they'll be like, oh, remember when that truck ran him over? And you're like,
Right.
so we were raised like that by
Yeah.
her. And my sister had a terrific sense of humor and very dark. And we had a lot of dark stuff to go over. And we always ended up cackling about it. And it just made it seem okay. Okay as in non-judged.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I say you can't be sad and crazy without funny, I guess what I'm saying is you can't really live life without having a strong handle on humor, because life is how it is and we don't know, you
Yeah.
know, and a lot of shitty things happen. Just a
Yeah.
lot. Like when you're little, you fail a test, you don't make the team, you just, you know, and then there's bigger awful things that happen
Mm.
and people get ill.
Yeah.
And, you know, you think you're being a fantastic parent and you're doing all the right things and you're very loving, and then some shit swerves into your kid's lane.
Yeah.
Oof. And you know,
Yeah.
you're a pediatrician. I mean, you must have
Yeah.
had
And you
conversations
don't
with
have
parents that
control of
no
those
one
things
wants to
anymore.
hear. You
No.
cannot control them.
Yeah.
That's the point. And so, in the absence of control, what is the one thing that's like a life raft? And I think it's humor, it's laughter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely for me. It's a very good. If anyone thinks, what is Sindhu's motto? It's you can't be sad and crazy without
That's
funny,
it. Right. Well,
because that's
and
tragic.
exactly. And the notion of course that being sort of a brand and a great thing for anyone to sort of like again try and find a way to take back some control out of the ups and downs is terrific. I loved how you figured out a way to, you know, get everything from Amar Chitrakatha into alphabet. And by the way, I hope you had you know good time at least conceiving those lines when you're writing it. But then I love the brand motto, right? And then I also love this idea of like, look, number one, I kick you. Number two, you hug me. There's some greatness there, and you know. If those experiences growing up that are, you know, a combination of just hilarious and painful and even sometimes just kind of tickling, you know, but you don't know why until you're maybe a little bit older. Um, are you someone who's driven at all by nostalgia? I mean, do you think of, you know, kind of some of these experiences in that sort of sweet, tender way now? But of course, back then they may have been a completely different feeling for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I've grown up, I've understood things, you know, differently. I mean, I was terribly bullied at the American school, terribly bullied, but no one at home would pathologize it. My mother,
Yeah,
my mother was like, "You're very dark. They're very fair. They call you Blackie. What's the problem?" And I was like, "Oh." She was like, "What is the question?" And
right.
she had a very, you know, old world, I would say, desi attitude to it. Is like, well, if you don't like it, just hit back, you
Yeah,
know. And but I was terribly bullied, terribly. I mean, if I look back, I think, ugh. Um, but now I think, yeah, and
yeah,
you know, but then perhaps that's because I haven't carried it heavy. You know, some people are bullied and it deforms their ability to think about themselves
mm,
in a
yeah,
in a in a in a in a loving way. I clearly have sort of got past that, but not completely. I I was I've been a very, very, very great beneficiary of two aspects of my parents, of two things, one from one parent and one from the other. My father has always drawn our attention back to the Bhagavad Gita, always, in
mm,
anything in life.
yeah,
Not from a religious point of view, but he always said it's a book by how to live.
sure.
And he's always always emphasized to us the nature of the world and our existence in it as being both outside our control, but a very beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And you have to manage your senses. You have to manage yourself while you face the lack of control. It's no bad thing. And even if you think it's a bad thing, who gives a shit? Because it's the thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So that's him. And then my mother, when I was 16, 17, she became a therapist. And she started one of the first nonprofit drug and alcohol rehabs in India.
Mm.
And she did the
Amazing.
28-day program and 12-step and AA. I've been to Alcoholic Anonymous meetings with her in Delhi because I had to drive her, and I'd be like, what am I doing here? I'd never even drunk alcohol at that point.
Mm.
So Western therapy gave my mother tools to really shed a lot of Indian parent tactics. So she apologized a lot. She said, oh my God, I can't believe I did that to you. I'm so sorry. By the way, let's move on. And that was hugely liberating. So those two things together have given me an ability to look at, as you say, the past and hold it more lightly.
Yeah.
And to believe in techniques, whether they're meditation or journaling or therapy. I'm a huge fan of therapy, by the way, I am, to those things that really hold hard, whether it's EMDR or whatever, to know that it's in my best interest to shed. It's no point holding on to it because no one gives a shit. It's done.
By the way, does that make the product better when you're out there on stage and when you're actually delivering humor, or when you're trying to keep practicing your craft and iterate at it? Does that shedding actually matter? And
Yes.
therefore you can actually make nostalgia a true sort of like vibrant piece as opposed to something where you're going backwards.
Yeah, I think it does because when I'm on stage and I'm telling you a story about how I've treated my two girlfriends by literally lying because I want to feel safe.
Right.
I'm trying to show you that I'm the problem, but I'm trying my best.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's very common. I think it takes the judgment out. Am I a good person? Who cares? You're trying your best.
Yeah.
And
No one gives a shit.
No one gives a shit. And also, of course, there are things you mustn't do that are truly bad, like crimes.
Right.
Okay, now, but I'm talking about as we navigate, whether it's our marriages or our closest friendships or our sibling relationships, we're gonna do some shitty things.
Yes. Yes.
And don't judge yourself so hard. Just maybe when the time comes, apologize. Because I think one of the ways in which I am able to see myself without judgment is that I think shitty things are possible and, right. And I think I want people to feel like that's how I feel about them because I get it, and I think a lot of people, when they watch my stand up, they do respond to that.
Yeah.
That there's no judgment.
Right.
You're always course correcting.
And that no lack of judgment, that course correction, I think that in a way, because we experience that, I think every profession experiences that a little bit. How are you more endearing and how are you more enduring? How do you make it that someone wants to come back and actually be a part of this, right? And if you can actually make it so that that platform has less judgment and everyone feels sort of like they have agency to embrace some of the shittiness, but take it forward and do it with some laughs. I think that's going to always be a wonderful and in a way kind of like a gentle way to make your way through some of that shittiness, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think like I talk a lot about marriage in ways that there are people online who are like, does she like being married? It's like, yeah.
Yeah. I do,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
I do, but that doesn't mean it's like super fun.
Right. Yeah. You
What are you
can
talking
joke a
about?
lot about it. So
Yes, you can. And also nothing pushes your buttons like the person you're married to.
yeah.
So your
Yeah.
shittiest self's gonna be hanging out.
Speaking of hanging out with your shitty self, I got a couple of quick rapid ones for
Okay,
you.
let's go.
And on that, I'm just making these up as I go along. What's your favorite thing about your husband? Like, what's the one thing that, like, you're like,
He's
I
very,
can't.
very fun.
He's very
He's
fun. Okay.
much, no, funny.
Oh, funny. Got it. Yeah.
He's one of the few people that can make me laugh
Ah,
out
yeah.
loud with just one sentence.
Amazing. Um, I saw a bunch of your online videos about mangoes. Do you have a
Oh, yes.
particular favorite? Is it
Yeah, I like Langra, which is a
Langra?
UP.
Where?
Yeah, Langra, which
It's a
is a UP
UP.
mango.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a
Okay.
later in the season mango.
Yeah, as
Langra.
a Marathi guy, I have to, Hapus and Alphonse. Sorry, that's
Hapus
that.
is nice. Hapus is nice. Alfonso, whatever. Everyone is eating that. It's like saying, I like chocolate ice cream. Yes, we know. But
Right.
Hapus is nice.
Hapus
I
is
like
is
that.
quite
Yeah.
exquisite.
I
Do
love
you
that.
and speaking of Amar Chitrakarta, do you have a particular favorite that you remember? Like, yeah, that was my go-to.
Uh, Jhansi Ki Rani.
Zanshi Ki Rani, kya baat hai? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Rani of Jhansi. Yeah. She fought with an eye out and her arm cut off. And yeah, Jhansi Ki
Baby
Rani
in
was
hand. Yeah.
I always read that.
Yeah. That was a
Not
good one. And then I think you and I are about the same age, but who is your, I think I know the answer to this given your wall hanging, but is there an 80s icon who,
Amitabh Bachchan.
there it is. Yeah. Have you met Amitabh Bachchan?
Yes. And I said something funny. I was like thinking the whole night and it worked. And he laughed and I was like, that's it. I can stop everything now.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's the mic drop.
that's it. I
Um,
didn't need anything else after that.
Sindhu, let me get you out of here on this. You've been doing stand-up now for what, 12, 13 years.
Yeah.
And, your journey has had lots of twists and turns. And um, as being a sort of comic artist and someone who writes and someone who acts, and with that great sort of brand tagline and now with really sort of a global brand following, um, ultimately, how do you, in a way, define success for yourself? Um, what's the motivator? Is there, other career paths? There's an end zone. There's something to strive for. There's a, look, I do this XYZ. There's a playbook and a blueprint for it. But in this particular case, do you have something that allows you to either measure success, whether that's a definable thing or something that you just sort of have in your head?
There's so many markers of success that are available to us, whether it's Instagram followers. I mean, as a comedian,
Yeah.
it's your IMDb page. So I suppose I adhere to all those, and I would like all those to be in the top, bracket. A plus plus, as my
A
father used to
plus.
say.
Yeah.
You must no, no you must get A plus plus. And it's like, what is that? I don't know what that is. I know what A
Yeah.
plus is. But
My
I
joke,
think
my joke about that was always that, like, hey, my parents said, like, why not 100? And then the day I get the 100, they're like, why not 105?
105, and you're like,
Right,
it's not allowed, Dad. It's not
right, right,
allowed.
right.
And gold medalist topper. It's like, oh my God. Anyway,
Super
all these
topper,
phrases.
super.
Super topper, super
Yeah,
topper.
yeah.
So those are there, and I have a love-hate relationship with them because of course I'm like, if I'm not making those, then am I doing anything? So that is in and out of my consciousness. In terms of what do I think is my definition of success, I have to be honest with you. I don't think I know yet. I think it will. I hope it makes itself clear to me at some point, so I can be like, oh, I haven't got there yet, or oh shit, I did that, I got there day before yesterday. Like, who knows? But I don't think I know, and I think that's probably the most complicated part of being someone who is in a profession that's also a calling. Because what is it supposed to be? I don't know.
Well, whether it's defining that as Sindhu Venkatanarayanan, the human and the family person, whether it's for a few people, and I hope not too many, just Hindu alphabet, or whether it's to many, many people out there who are learning about you and getting to know you and rediscovering you and really celebrating you as Sindhu Vee. I'm so grateful that we had some time to catch up. Sindhu, thank you so much for joining, and Really just a
Thank you.
treat. I hope we can visit with you down the road.
Yes, thank you so much. That's very kind.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.